Hello, it's February 7th, 2017. I'm Tony Samario, coming to you from BroSal.org YouTube channel. And I wanted to talk a little bit about World War III this week. There's been so much going on in the past week that I can't get my attention where I want it back on the Bible study. Going through the book of Job. I really want to go through Revelation, but for those interested in the geopolitical scene and what's happening, I just find it such a bombardment right now that it's hyper everything. Everything is on hyper mode, so that the sensationalism and the effect I believe right now it's meant to have is to drive us all psychologically in the West especially into this state of hysteria, which is what then can be used to pit us against each other in the divide and conquer type of paradigm that it seems, most likely that we're burdened by as a populace. We can't help it. That's the way it is. The people in charge are dividing and conquering the world. It seems, if you go back, who first had the money to do that? Well, these people that made the first Rothschild their court agent back in 1769. And then just a few years later, in a connection that seems clear enough, you have the birth of the Illuminati through this sort of money as an agent now to perform something. The secret agency to be behind the scenes and get it all done. Now, all that could be myth. You have to look at the world we live in and put together the pieces and see, is it, what's the likelihood that sort of program has been carried on for 150 years, 250 years almost when you go back to the beginning of it. But when you start to see the way it was taking effect, you had other countries kicking these people out. This is just like you had Russia saying no to the Rothschilds' original League of Nations when they wanted to get the world under their tentacles grip, in the early 1800s. And the Tsar of Russia said, no way, it's clear, what that would be. It would be agreeing to basically put my military in your hands, let you use the militaries of the world to do your bidding against other nations. No thanks. And Rothschild back then declared that one of my descendants is going to get you czars and you won't sit on the powers of Russia anymore. And about 100 years later, Bolshevik Revolution funded by the same money, that's what happened. Got rid of that czar line that didn't want, could see what it was going to mean. Why? Why? What's that all about? Well, the real connection is the fact that the czars led Orthodox Christianity, Christian Russia. And Zionist Rothschild, this idea that I don't know that it was Rothschild's, he's the agent perhaps to pull it off. But this idea of Zionism, to go get that. And Zionism, that's a political term that appears around the early 1900s in response to anti-Semitism, also invented at that time. But when you go back to the birth of the Illuminati over 100 years earlier, you have to imagine some plan was afoot, rule the world, okay, from where, how, under what sort of pretext. So it's not, for me, unbelievable that these people that we know today, this Rothschild banking cartel that winds up with all the money, at the start of their game, one of the reasons they wind up with all the money is because they're in with all the rulers of Europe, and they're spending their money. And that's what makes our, sort of our old Catholic Church connection, but we'll leave that for another day. This whole idea that the Jesuits are running the world, that's where that comes from, because ultimately somebody had to put those Rothschilds in charge of money and banking. Who gave them the money to loan to countries. So that's a whole study on its own. But what it seems to have birthed right about the time that America was birthed, strangely enough, 1776, the Illuminati. So this long-term plan, perhaps, of ruling the world, and then comes this idea that, well, the Jewish prophecy provides for that. And is that, so which one came first? I don't know. Is Rothschild's acting on behalf of the idea that they're going to reclaim the promised land for God and rule the world forever? Or does that come along as an expedient to a bunch of bankers who are just planning on ruling the world one way or another? At our point, I don't think it really matters. The important, lineage, or the important observation of the lineage of history is that from that time till now, the control that's been exercised, the money that's been spent to begin the Bolshevik Revolution, to decimate, if not genocidally, go after the Orthodox Christians of Russia for almost a full century. And then that's all now changing. But I'm trying to give it that deeper look to what we see in our news today, because I want to talk about sort of the opposition that's being set up, the antithesis that I believe has always been set up. Because we're talking about, Russia 100 years ago, China 70, almost 80 years ago, Iran 70 years, 60 to 60 years anyway, to 70 years ago. These are the main players coming out now as the power against the Allied force, the hegemony of Western civilization. And so just in the news, what strikes me is, if you just look at the way these people are being portrayed to us in our propaganda, Iran, they keep showing us a picture of one missile going off in the air, telling us Iran doesn't have any nuclear weapons. They're test firing a missile. And yeah, someday, 10 years from now, they might be able to strap a nuke to it. Of course, North Korea is threatening the world. They have nukes. They're testing them. They're testing their missiles. But Iran's a real problem, see, because Iran's got a lot of people that could overrun. And perhaps it's prophesied that someday they will overrun that Middle East and Jerusalem. And so I believe in the idea of a left-right paradigm, problem, reaction, solution. Iran's being set up as the enemy, the central enemy around which a coalition can be formed. Iran, they supply the arms, right, to Hezbollah and Hamas and the people who threaten. They're the Zionist resistance of the Middle East, essentially. They're known as the largest terrorist state in the world, according to us, the United States. And yet Russia just came out and said, we disagree with that. They're not a terrorist state. So that's interesting, right? The biggest arms manufacturer on the other side, Russia, right? The nemesis, the Cold War nemesis, the new Cold War nemesis, our nemesis Russia comes out and tells us, no, Iran's not a terrorist state. So if you don't see a sort of left-right split setting up there, they can't even agree on what terrorism is and who's a terrorist state, huh? Russia also says you shouldn't alter this nuclear deal that the Obama administration made. As much as Russia doesn't like Obama and prefers Trump, on the one hand, they don't prefer that Trump come in and change the nuclear deal with Iran. So it just shows the closeness, is what I'm trying to point out. Iran and Russia have a certain relationship that puts them, at odds with the United States, especially the way it's being portrayed today. Because we all have to go to war over everything, of course. There's no way to live and let live. There's no way to let these people do what, live the way they want in the world. I mean, there's just no opportunity except everyone has to fight. And the Americans say, because they won't, the Russian aggression, Chinese aggression, Palestinian aggression. And what's so funny about all that, when you look at all those places where so-called aggression's going on, it's all been Christian Zionist money that have been running those places the whole time. Whether it's Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, Go back 100 years, Sykes-Picot Agreement. France and England got all that territory we call the Middle East. Russia was, Bolshevik Revolution, those people were funded by the same Zionist bank. Cultural Revolution in China, same deal. To set up this paradigm, this boogeyman enemy that we could have in the end. So I'm just pointing out that in our news today now, you have Iran. We don't even know what's true. I am telling you, whenever they tell us, Iran's got massive military drills, and then they show us pictures of God knows what and when, one tank rolling around or some people marching or some picture from an official propaganda video or whatever, but nothing that's absolute journalism where there's no doubt that, whoa, look at that. They're reporting on a drill that's going on today. And they're showing me the pictures that go with that report so that I can see the report is validated by the photographic evidence. Here's the drill. Here's what it looks like today going on. It's funny how we've had a war going on with Syria for 3 years. I've yet to see a picture of a war. I see a few blown up buildings. I see some Toyota trucks driving in a line with ISIS fighters in perfectly clean uniforms. I see the occasional tank shooting off some rounds. I see, one bomb drop on a building. They told me 50,000 bombs or something have been dropped on these people. It's resulted in 11 million refugees fleeing a war zone. I've yet to see a picture of a war zone or a war going on or a clash of forces. I've yet to see one actual photo of a war in 3 years. Just a bunch of footage of stuff, of warlike stuff. I mean, Hollywood shows me that in every movie. So Iran's threatening self-defense. They're saying, hey man, we're not going to attack anyone. That's not our way, but we're going to be ready if you attack us. China, to bring them into this unholy alliance of the opposition, China protesting the sanctions we're putting on Iran for testing a missile. Because they don't get to test a missile. Israel gets to have enough weapons to wipe out every neighbor. Saudi Arabia gets to have enough weapons to terrorize Yemen, who are related, in many levels, through their religion, through their people, to the Shiites of Iran. So they can't protect their neighbor. Our narrative is so absurd. Who's done all the damage over there? It's been the American CIA, and it's been all the American weapons. We gave the weapons to Saddam Hussein to go attack Iran. Where does Saddam get the weapons? We give the weapons to Saudi Arabia to attack Yemen, right? And so where does Iran get their weapons? They don't make them all. They make a few, but they don't make the kind of weapons you can worry about. They get them from Russia, of course, the great enemy that was broke 20 years ago. That not a single journalist and hardly a researcher I can find outside of myself bothers to ask, who funded them? Where'd they get them? Who loaned them the money? How'd they extract it from their economy, which didn't even exist 20 years ago? They were so broke, we were told their people were freezing to death in the winter. They were starving to death in the summer. They couldn't get their hands on a loaf of bread, but they could rebuild an army in 20 years as big as the United States, if not bigger and meaner and more advanced. In an economy they didn't have, oil prices the last few years that have been in the tank, sanctions against them, and yet they supply Iran with weapons. So nobody bothers to investigate how do their people possibly live? How do they accomplish all this? If they couldn't do it then, if they went broke in the 80s, when, theoretically, they're a little better off on oil, they were a little better off on weapon sales, they were a little bit, right? They were, they had been Cold War champions for 20 years. They'd been supplying all them communist countries from Cuba to China to North Korea to Iran with weapons. How were they so broke in the 80s and they're so rich now? They can do anything they want. Russian aggression. They're aggressive. So now China chimes in on the fact that these additional sanctions on Iran are hurting them as well. Because when you talk about China in this alliance, you got to realize the war has got to be stimulated against Russia, China, Iran on one side, or you don't have enough of a war. It's going to be over too soon if it's all the NATO allies against just Iran, all the NATO allies against just China, all the NATO allies against just Russia. But Russia, China, Iran, with your odd one thrown in there like Brazil, because of their connection to the economic ties that they're creating this supposed alternative money system called BRICS through China. See, that's how China's being made a big enemy on every front. I mean, I grew up all my life. China was the slave country to the U.S. industrialists. I don't know how they got so rich to threaten everybody. Yeah, they got a lot of people, but people can be killed with a big bomb. We did that to the Japanese, long time ago. So why are we worried about so many people? How are they going to get anywhere? On what transport planes that we can't blow up? On what ships? They're talking about building their second aircraft carrier, as in 1 and 2, number 1 and number 2. How many have we got? How many of the allies got that we're worried about a Chinese military engagement? That they hold all their only money they have to build more, to order more stuff like gas and oil from Russia and military equipment and whatever. The only money they have comes from the fact that we guarantee the debt that they hold. USA, they own all our worthless debt. And so only as long as the USA is strong is China strong anyway. Why would you make an enemy out of the USA? That's where you get all your money to run your economy. And so all this seems to be set up, to me. All of a sudden China's threatening us, cyber hacking us. Why? Because they're making an alliance with Russia and Iran. You mean the people the Rothschilds started? You mean Iran that the CIA's been in when we overthrew Mossadegh in the 50s and gave them the Shah? That Iran? That's who we're worried about? That even today, their Iranian people seem to know the mullahs are in bed with the big banks like everybody? So when you uncover the cover story, you see that Russia's got no reason to have such a weapons parity unless someone wants them to. You see that China's got no reason to be America's enemy unless someone's pulling that string. And Iran doesn't even have a weapon. Who are they threatening when they're talking about Israel with all the nuclear weapons? Right? And so what's going on today in the news? Hamas just threatening Israel. Right? They're all in the streets. They're PO'd, as of course they should be, these poor Palestinians. I mean, they just don't stop pushing them since 67, right? Just building in that territory and pushing and oppressing and keeping them down to the point that these people have to throw rocks at their oppressors for 50 years. And the world, the Western world, the Trump world now selling you on the fact that these are the people that have to stop throwing their rocks at the guys with all the guns that won't stop building and won't respect the original deal that was a deal enforced militarily anyway. When they came in, the UN said, we're going to give them a state, but just this land, just this much. So then the war starts right after that, and it never stops. And Israel just keeps winning more land. So I don't want to go into the fact that I look at it now, it's quite easy to see that the wars were stimulated by the Zionist Christian forces in those Muslim countries, which had already undermined them through the Kingdom of Saud and such, that I'm quite sure all of that was orchestrated in order to allow Israel to expand, since the people that funded this whole thing for 100 years go back, that funded the Federal Reserve System, that funded the Bolshevik Revolution, that funded getting America into World War I on behalf of Great Britain in promise to get Palestine, that funded World War II on both sides to create the Holocaust, to create the reality of anti-Semitism, to get the Jews to want to immigrate to Palestine? Why'd they want to leave Germany and Poland and all these countries? They'd been living there for a long time in perfect harmony and peace with their neighbors. In fact, they'd become rich and very prosperous as people who did trade. And that's what the whole conditions, the Versailles Treaty was set up to turn that against the Jews and break the German economy, and they blamed it on the Jews, that it was the Jews' fault. The Jews had ripped them off. Same thing, same story they're going to use again to turn the one force that they want to be turned against the Jews, blame the Jews, when it's, the bankers don't really care about Judaism. If they did, they'd follow the law of Moses, but they don't do that. That's why they're referred to in Scripture as a synagogue of Satan, those who claim to be Jews but are not. So all of that plays in the Zionist picture, this Christian Zionist relationship that's on the other side. But today what I was seeing in all the news was the way the Iran, China, Russia triangle is being reinforced for us to show us how, through something as simple as Hamas threatening Israel, something being launched at Israel, that ties into Iran because they're the greatest terrorist supporter. It's all goes back to them. So Iran has to be held now responsible. But Russia's saying, now wait a minute, that's our partner in trade. So you can only push so far. China already saying the same thing. Hey, wait a minute. You're putting sanctions that are hurting us for no reason. China's being accused of this aggression right now in the South China Seas. They're, of course, they supply North Korea. Even though they put sanctions, they're still somewhat responsible for North Korea. They're Russia's economic partner, of course. That's where they get their gas and oil. So they're not about to, they've got to stay tied to Russia. They're a trading partner with Iran. And through probably U.S. instigation right now, they're going to be involved in a trade war with the United States. Not to mention all the paper they hold. So they've got, there's all this tension now. And China has nowhere to go, is what I want everybody to see, the way they've set the world up. These three countries, Russia, China, Iran, have nowhere to go but with each other. All right? And Russia now, you just have, a mouthpiece like Bill O'Reilly, the Fox News mouthpiece, calling Russia's president a killer. Is that politically, is that even true? We don't call Obama a killer, though, many people in America call him a killer. But how would we respond if in their official political channels they get on there and say Obama the killer? That doesn't bode well for political relations with someone that you don't want to drive into World War, do you, Bill? Are you looking for World War with Russia? Is that nice to not point out that he's been accused of such things? Is this the kind of man? What do you think of those accusations? Is he a killer? Are we supposed to, I don't know. You're talking about a president who promotes the idea that it would be better to be friends. Why do we want to go to war? That's, of course, a logical conclusion. And then a whole world that, journalistic, supposedly a propaganda world that presents Russia as a killer. Russian aggression, that's the term for years now in the media, Russian aggression. The Ukraine, who Russia likes to keep pointing out, which our journalists don't, that something like a 93% referendum, guys. Since when does America ever have 93% of the people vote on anything? When does any state have 93% of its citizens vote on anything? And yet Russia keeps pointing out in Ukraine, 93% of Ukrainians turned out and said, we want to be part of Russia. And we accuse them of Russian aggression for trying to defend the 93%. It's so absurd that at least the discussion doesn't include all sides of the argument. We just say Russian aggression. Does that sound like we're trying to find a middle ground? Or are we trying to just push like two bullies on a playground, shoving each other's shoulder until one takes a swing? Several months ago, we discussed a big article that came out in our propaganda crap that said Russia knows only one way, right? They're putting all their money into military. They're taking this aggressive stance in the world because they only know one way to advance their empire. They're just a belligerent, militaristic bully. All they know is to go in and push their way in through military and expand their territory, to expand their ideals being nothing but expansion through military, right? This is what this article, I don't know which show it is, but it's months ago that we covered this, where we the USA were promoting through our garbage propaganda the idea that, you know, Russia was just such a belligerent stupidity of an empire, of a nation that's been around for how long, right? That the only thing that's on their mind is how we can use our military to bully our way into more territory, because that's such an expansionist ideal that everyone's going to want to follow. So that's how we paint Russia, right? Not as a country with anything to offer the world, but just a bully that wants to expand militarily for no other reason than to keep expanding militarily. And that's why they have to be stopped, their aggression. Of course, Russia is China's biggest energy supplier and also a BRICS partner. So again, who's going to have to side with Russia when push comes to shove over existence in the New World Order? And then Iran, of course, is one of Russia's, if not Russia's biggest arms buyer. So, and one of their Middle Eastern partners in such things like Syria, the territory that needs to be maintained in Syria for Russia's strategic reasons. So, Russia is painted as this uncontrollable, unreasonable, irrational enemy, and they just happen to be tied at the hip to our other two unreasonable, irrational enemies, Iran and China. So that's, what's coming in the vision of World War III this week, as far as I can tell. We're making sure that we show the cemented nature of the relationship of our, the enemy that will eventually be the great enemy. And I say that's all not going to come just because of the Palestinian conflict and the Zionist Islamic conflict that Pike predicted would wipe out both. I say that that's all part of a bigger setup that's got to do with the economic conflict that's being presented with BRICS now being the alternative to the petrodollar hegemony. And that's what the countries will eventually all have to, Brazil, Philippines, everyone will have to jump into that war, because it's going to mean who's really going to control who's going to really live and die in the new world fallout of all this? Who's going to have the economy of the future? Whose ideals are going to run the future, right? And so, and I think that's part of this setup of this NATO BS talk by, the fool's gold Trump presidency, the transition, this great transition toward World War III, that Trump's leading, the weapons of the West on, is to put more economic pressure on our so-called allies. That's what this talk about NATO is. It's not as if we're going to run away from these countries, because we need them all to fight each other in the end. We're dividing right now. Who's going to go? Hungary, obviously. See, they're going to be on Russia's team. You can see that already. Whereas Poland, they're probably going to be on the NATO team, but everybody's going to be divided one way. You're either going to be on the Russia, Iran, China team, or you're going to be on the USA, Britain, Australia, Canada, probably France and Germany team, although I think Europe's getting ready to be divided. Who knows who Germany's going to go with? Turkey's probably going to be on the Russia, Iran, China team because of all the economic ties and otherwise, as I say, the promise that he's going to get the caliph of the Muslims in the end, where the NATO team's promising it to the Hashemite king. But everybody's going to be divided up. And so I think all this talk about NATO, Trump's pointing out, we want to protect our allies, but they got to pay their fair share. So it's extracting money out of them after we've stolen it through the 2008, bubble that they got all Europe's banks into and broke Europe, or, helped to break Europe and create this social unrest over there. Now they're just going to add to it, like in Greece, by making them pony up more money, which causes more stress on the socioeconomic system and impose more, draconian measures of austerity and all these other kind of things. Get more people to join the military because it's the only thing that pays. So I think that's what that talk's all about. It's just to help divide Europe, put more pressure on them economically, get them in that position that they need to be in when the time comes for war. Push everybody onto the side that someone's predetermined they need to be in for maximum effect, which I'm afraid is maximum casualty in this next conflict. It's really a less populated world that the people in charge want to restructure with their electronic banking system and their new temple and all of that. And that's why I think these wars have to escalate. They want people dead. They want people set up to be dead. And in the end, I think that they imagine that they're going to control this war as they've controlled the last war. But it would appear that something goes wrong. That the eschatological view. Something goes wrong in their plan because it results in the city and temple being destroyed. And so, is it natural disasters? Is it supernatural influence that they're not counting on? That's one of those interesting things that we do, our eschatological study, to just make ourselves aware of what the eschatology points to. It's hard for me to know, except that Revelation, which seems to be one of the most effective of the eschatological tools for everyone, suggests a lot of natural disaster. A shaking that goes on that moves mountains and islands, stars falling out of the sky. It almost seems to describe a polar shift. And perhaps that's why it says that everyone's hiding in the rocks and the caves, praying for the rocks to fall on them to hide them from the face of him who sits on the throne. So there's your evidence that at some point there's going to be, how does everybody know that somebody sits on the throne? And that whose face are they seeing? What are they, what are people so scared of? What have they seen? Remember, Revelation also talks about this big deception coming with this miracles. I'm going to cause the image to speak in the temple. So there's a supernatural element that eschatology brings into it that's hard to account for, in the idea of just a World War III over the geopolitical landscape that we've watched come into view, meaning the last 100 years setting up these communists against the great Christian nation, putting the Christians with the Zionists to go reestablish Palestine, pitting therefore the Christian Zionists against the Muslim Arab nations, dividing the Arab nations into this Sunni Shia paradigm that keeps them at war so they can't unite, destroying the Asian nations during World War, Korean War, and the Vietnam War, to make sure that they could never unite and stop any of this. I don't even know how to put it. This Aryan race of maniacs from this cartel of elitists from owning the world. To me, that's what that fourth beast of Daniel is. This this terrible and dreadful beast that stomps down the whole world. Why there's only 4? Because that beast, what came out of that, the stomping down, the converting the world to your method, never has ended. That Roman Empire, whatever that ideology behind that Roman Empire, the sun worship that continues to this day, that's never ended. That's obviously part of that beast system from the eschatological standpoint that goes all the way back, certainly to fallen angels if that's the way it really happened. Then the system that was set up as the alternative that the Tower of Babel represented. And then that, to my view, becomes focused in the Temple of Solomon, having Ashtoreth, the Solomon himself building Ashtoreth poles, turning the temple into an abomination in his time already, and following him becoming so corrupt that 800 years before Christ, right after Solomon's reign, God divorces his people, tells them, "You're not my people. You'll be scattered." And he brings the Babylonians, first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians in to destroy the temple and scatter them. And so, this part of the story, if you're going to try to bring two sticks together, being the physical geopolitical stick of that we live through as a history, and we watch the war coming because of thesis versus antithesis, the hegemony versus those trying to resist the hegemony. You can see the geopolitical scheme. But what you don't see is very easily is how that geopolitical scheme has been heavily manipulated over the last 100 years to be what it is. That this hegemony versus anti-hegemony is not grassroots. It's been propagandized to the peoples of each place to adhere to their system. But that's not something that just has grown up naturally. That has been manipulated and fostered and funded and painstakingly created. So Iran could be what it is, so Russia could be what it is, so China could be what it is, just as America could be what it is, and England could be what it is, and France and Germany and China could all, that the funding's been coming from too long to imagine those places are something other than what the people 100 years ago doing all the funding have been manipulating them to be. So that even the geopolitical stick must be seen as something that's being brought together on purpose to create this war. That this triangle of Iran and Russia and China and the threat of ISIS and terrorism and Israel being at the heart of it over there are all part of a bigger scheme. It's not just happening as a reaction day by day, year by year, but as a problem, reaction, solution paradigm that goes back at least 100 years, if not a couple of 100 years in its deeper application. I think that's the important factor to watch. And then the other stick of eschatology would say that first stick has a supernatural mastermind or end game. There's something coming from beyond that's being manifest as this geopolitical stick. So that one can be watched for by each person in their own way, and the evidence of it can be found for each person for themselves. But the geopolitical scheme that we're watching, there's no doubt in my mind there's nowhere for this to end, because there's no doubt in my mind that it was always meant to end in a giant war. They're not reacting by going to war. They're preparing for war and laying each of the pieces in place like a mastermind with an idea, an end game, as the result, the solution, problem, reaction, solution. They have something like that in mind, at least for the last 100 years. And so we're seeing at least a 100-year-old plan coming to fruition. And that's why I think all of the things that are going on right now have been well orchestrated. Iran, China, Russia were always going to be the force for this third world war. And that's why you're going to watch them show us in our media, I believe, the unconditional ties between them, as they continue to show the unconditional ties between the Christian and the Zionists, and how that pits them against the scourge of Islamic radicalization, without ever showing you that it's the Christian Zionists that paid for the scourge of radicalization 100 years ago with the Kingdom of Saud, most recently, and then again through that time with Al-Qaeda, and then again with ISIS, and through Iran to Hezbollah, and to present the left-right paradigm. That's all come through Russia, Iran, which the banking same people started all that. So the funding's all been there to create this war of parity. That's the odd thing after World War II. How is it possible that we could have two sides? I mean, wouldn't the people behind the scenes that have been putting their fingers in other people's business for, at least the 70 years we know of since the official creation of the CIA and that type of thing, why wouldn't those people be trying to calculate how to keep any one group of people from becoming so solidified that you could have a giant war of two great entities that could threaten the whole world? It's essentially what, it's like they've done on purpose what Brzezinski wrote about in the Grand Chessboard, that the only thing the hegemony has to fear is, a couple of potential groups of people that could come together. The one he mentions is the one we wiped out through the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and that we continue to wipe out financially, that whole Asian population. The fact that if they were to all come together, they'd be unstoppable as a people. They could start their own economic system. They could, they could threaten the USA Western hegemony. And also the Middle East, the Arabs. If all the Arabs, Persians and such, Turks all came together, from Saudi Arabia to Turkey, boy, and over there to Persia, watch out. They could threaten. So, that was written about many, what was it, 70s or 80s. So it was certainly thought about in the think tanks. Isn't it funny that today what you have is exactly the sort of hegemony or anti-hegemonic gathering of forces that was warned about. And it's all paid for by this same system that all along could have stopped it, had it really wanted to. The Iran, China, Russia anti-hegemonic triangle is what's been formed to be that opponent to the hegemony. So anyway, World War III this week is that you're seeing the emergence now of the force that can't help but come together and think about what type of unified force China, Russia, and Iran present. How many people are going to die in a conflict that pits an equal-sized force against them? Thanks for being here, guys. Keep loving your neighbor out there. Please look forward to the Bible study to continue as soon as I get a little time on my hands and can get back to it. Talk to you next week. See you next week.